Sarah Johnson was a simple woman with a complicated life. At 42, the lines around her eyes told stories of both laughter and sorrow. She lived in a small blue house on Maple Street in Riverdale, a town where everyone knew each other's business but still managed to mind their own. Every morning, Sarah woke up at 5:30 a.m. to make breakfast for her son, Michael. He was 17, tall and kind, with his father's smile and his mother's determination. Michael was her world, especially since her husband Tom had passed away from cancer 3 years ago. Sarah worked as a nurse at Riverdale General Hospital. Her shifts were long, but she never complained. The extra hours meant Michael could join the football team and save for college. She wanted him to have chances she never had. "Mom, I got this. Stop worrying so much," Michael would tell her, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he headed out to school. Sarah would smile and nod, but mothers never stop worrying. On Tuesdays, Sarah volunteered at the community center, teaching English to new immigrants. Her students loved her patience and the way she made difficult words seem easy. This was where she got a parking ticket one rainy evening, rushing in late after covering for a coworker. The yellow paper tucked under her windshield wiper was quickly stuffed into her purse and forgotten. April 10th started like any normal Thursday. Sarah made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, a tradition from Michael's childhood that he pretended to be too old for but secretly loved. He had a big football game that night, and Sarah promised to be there early to get a good seat. "I'm going to score a touchdown just for you, Mom," Michael said, giving her a quick hug before heading to school. "I'll be the one screaming loudest," Sarah promised. That afternoon, Sarah hurried through her shift. Dr. Peterson needed last-minute lab results, Mrs. Garcia needed extra pain medication, and the new nurse needed help with paperwork. By the time Sarah looked at the clock, she was already running late. She raced to her car, the keys jangling in her hand. Rain was starting to fall, making the roads shine under the gray sky. Sarah turned on the radio, humming along to an old song that reminded her of dancing with Tom in their kitchen. The call came at 5:48 p.m. Sarah was still 10 minutes from the school when her phone rang. She pulled over to answer, expecting Michael to ask where she was. Instead, it was Coach Wilson, his voice shaking. "Sarah, there's been an accident." Michael collapsed during warm-ups. "The ambulance is taking him to Riverdale General right now." The world stopped for Sarah. Her hands went cold. Her heart forgot how to beat. She turned her car around, driving back to the hospital she had just left. The rain fell harder now, matching the tears on her face. Sarah prayed to God, to Tom, to anyone who might be listening. Please let him be okay. But Michael wasn't okay. A hidden heart condition had been waiting like a time bomb inside his young body. By the time Sarah arrived at the hospital, doctors were already working on her son. She watched through a window as they pressed on his chest, pushed air into his lungs, and tried to restart his heart. At 6:22 p.m., Dr. Anderson stopped. He looked at the clock, then walked slowly to where Sarah stood frozen. His words fell like stones. "I'm sorry, Sarah. We did everything we could." Sarah's world ended that evening. She forgot how to eat, how to sleep, how to breathe without pain. And somewhere in her purse, she forgot about a simple parking ticket that would change everything. The days after Michael's death passed in a fog for Sarah. Friends and neighbors brought food that filled her refrigerator but remained uneaten. Cards and flowers crowded her small living room, their sweet smell mixing with grief in a way that made her stomach turn. Sarah took a leave of absence from the hospital. Her coworkers understood. They covered her shifts and called to check on her, but after a while, the calls became less frequent. People had their own lives to return to, while Sarah remained frozen in her worst moment. Michael's room stayed exactly as he left it that Thursday morning. His football jersey hung on the back of his chair. His homework sat half-finished on his desk. His bed remained unmade, the sheets still holding the shape of his body. Sarah would sit there for hours, holding his pillow to her face, trying to catch the fading scent of her son. "I should have known about his heart," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm a nurse. I should have seen the signs." The funeral had been beautiful, if such a thing could be called beautiful. The entire football team wore their jerseys and formed an honor guard. Michael's teammates shared stories about his kindness, his humor, his way of making everyone feel included. Sarah sat in the front row, Tom's mother holding her hand tightly as they watched the casket being lowered into the ground next to where Tom rested. Bill payments, insurance forms, and sympathy cards piled up on Sarah's kitchen table. She opened some and ignored others. The world of paperwork and responsibilities seemed meaningless now. What did a water bill matter when her son was gone? What did anything matter? 6 weeks after the funeral, Sarah finally returned to work. Her supervisor put her on light duty, assigning her to the quiet night shift where she wouldn't have to interact with too many patients or their families. Sarah moved through the hospital halls like a ghost, doing her job with mechanical precision, but without the warmth that once made her special. "Johnson, you holding up okay?" Dr. Peterson asked one night, finding her staring blankly at a patient chart. "I'm fine," Sarah answered automatically, the lie coming easily now. At home, Sarah started putting Michael's things in boxes. His clothes still smelled like him, a mix of teenage boy deodorant and the pine-scented detergent she always used. Each shirt, each pair of jeans, each wrinkled sock represented a memory she wasn't ready to lose. The boxes remained unsealed, sitting in corners of rooms Sarah now avoided. 3 months after Michael died, Sarah's neighbor Patty knocked on her door one evening. Sarah hadn't been answering her phone, and Patty was worried. "There's mail piling up in your box, honey," Patty said, handing Sarah a stack of envelopes. "Some of these look important." Sarah thanked her and set the mail on top of the other unopened letters on her kitchen table. That night, unable to sleep, she finally started sorting through the pile. Electric bills, cable bills, junk mail offering credit cards to a woman whose credit was the last thing on her mind. Then she found it, a bright orange envelope marked "Final Note IC" from the Riverdale Municipal Court. Inside was a letter explaining that her unpaid parking ticket from the community center had escalated to a $350 fine for non-payment. Worse, she was being summoned to appear before Judge William Crawford the following Monday. Sarah dropped the letter as if it had burned her fingers. The parking ticket from that rainy Tuesday, before Michael died, before her world ended, had completely slipped from her mind. Now, in the middle of her grief, the law was demanding her attention. The letter stated clearly, "Failure to appear may result in a warrant for your arrest." Sarah looked around her empty house, at the boxes of Michael's things, at the photos of her son that watched her from every wall. She had already lost everything that mattered. What more could a judge possibly take from her? Monday morning arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle that matched Sarah's mood. She stood in front of her closet, trying to decide what to wear to court. It seemed like such a silly thing to worry about, but she hadn't given thought to her appearance in months. She finally chose a simple black dress, the same one she had worn to Michael's funeral. It was the only thing that still fit her properly. Sarah had lost so much weight since his death that her other clothes hung on her frame like they belonged to someone else. As she brushed her hair for the first time in days, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her once vibrant brown hair now showed strands of gray she hadn't noticed before. Grief had aged her 10 years in 3 months. "You need to pull yourself together," she whispered to her reflection, but the woman in the mirror looked unconvinced. Sarah drove slowly to the courthouse, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The last time she had driven this route was to sign Michael's death certificate. The memory made her stomach twist into knots. The Riverdale Municipal Court was a tall brick building in the center of town. Its steps were crowded with people coming and going, normal people with normal problems. Sarah felt like an alien among them, marked by a loss they couldn't see. Inside, the courthouse smelled like furniture polish and paper. Sarah checked in with a clerk who barely looked up from her computer. "Courtroom 3. Have a seat until your name is called." Courtroom 3 was packed with people waiting for their cases to be heard. Some looked nervous, others bored. A young man in a suit tapped away at his phone. An elderly woman knitted something small and blue. Sarah found an empty spot on a back bench and sat down, clutching her purse in her lap. One by one, people were called forward. Most cases took only minutes: speeding tickets, parking violations, minor offenses that seemed so trivial to Sarah now. Judge Crawford, a tall man with thick glasses and a stern face, worked through the cases efficiently. His voice was deep and carried through the courtroom without needing a microphone. "Pay the fine by Friday. Community service, 40 hours. Case dismissed for lack of evidence." Sarah watched the clock tick slowly toward noon. Her hands had started to shake, and she clasped them tightly together to make them stop. What would she say to the judge? How could she explain that a parking ticket had been the last thing on her mind while planning her son's funeral? Sarah Johnson. Her name echoed through the courtroom, making her jump. Sarah stood on unsteady legs and made her way to the front. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet as she approached the bench. Ms. Johnson, you're here for an unpaid parking violation from April 3rd. The original fine was $50, which has now increased to $350 due to failure to respond to multiple notices. How do you plead? Judge Crawford didn't look up from his papers as he spoke. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. The room suddenly felt too hot, too crowded. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry bees. Ms. Johnson, the judge prompted, finally looking up at her. I forgot. Sarah managed to say, her voice barely audible. Judge Crawford frowned. You forgot to pay a ticket that was issued 5 months ago, despite 3 notices sent to your home? Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of strangers. But the dam was breaking. My son died, she whispered. The words hung in the air between them. Something in the judge's expression shifted slightly. He set down his pen and leaned forward. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? He asked, his tone softer now. My son, Michael. He died on April 10th, a heart condition we didn't know he had. Sarah's voice cracked. The ticket was in my purse. I forgot about everything after that. The mail, the bills, the notices. I'm sorry. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Judge Crawford's stern expression melted away, replaced by something Sarah hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine human concern. Ms. Johnson, he said quietly, please take a seat. We'll return to your case after a short recess. Confused, Sarah nodded and returned to her bench. For the first time that day, she felt like someone had actually seen her, not just another case number, but a mother drowning in grief. The recess lasted 15 minutes, but to Sarah, it felt like hours. She sat alone on the wooden bench, watching as people filtered out of the courtroom for coffee or smoke breaks. A few curious glances were directed her way, but no one approached her. Sarah was used to this by now, the way people kept their distance from grief, as if it might be catching. She noticed a court officer speaking quietly with Judge Crawford in the hallway. The judge nodded several times, his face serious as he listened. Once, he glanced through the doorway at Sarah, his expression unreadable behind his thick glasses. When court resumed, the room was noticeably quieter. The clerk called several more cases before Sarah's name was announced again. With a deep breath, she made her way back to the front of the courtroom, her legs steadier this time but her heart racing. Judge Crawford looked different somehow. The stern lines around his mouth had softened, and he studied Sarah's face with careful attention. Ms. Johnson, he began, his deep voice gentler than before, I've taken the liberty of reviewing your case more thoroughly during our recess. He paused, adjusting his glasses. I understand you work as a nurse at Riverdale General? Sarah nodded, surprised by the question. Yes, Your Honor. For 15 years now. And your son, Michael? He was 17. The sound of Michael's name from a stranger's lips made Sarah's chest tighten. Yes, he would have graduated high school next spring. The judge nodded slowly. I've spoken with Officer Davis, who issued your parking ticket. He remembers you from the community center where you volunteer teaching English. Is that correct? I used to, Sarah said quietly. I haven't been back since April. Judge Crawford folded his hands on top of his desk. The courtroom was so silent that Sarah could hear the ticking of the large clock on the wall. Ms. Johnson, the law is designed to be fair but not always compassionate. Rules exist for good reasons, but sometimes life hands us circumstances that no rulebook can address. He cleared his throat. I've been a judge in this town for 22 years. I've seen every excuse imaginable for why someone couldn't pay a fine or appear in court when summoned. Sarah prepared herself for the lecture, for the punishment that would follow. It didn't matter much to her anymore. A fine was just money. What was money when compared to what she had already lost? But I've rarely encountered someone with a reason as heartbreaking as yours, the judge continued, his voice softening further. 3 years ago, my wife and I lost our daughter Emma to leukemia. She was 19, studying to become a teacher. Sarah looked up, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time. Behind his professional demeanor, she recognized something familiar, the same hollow look she saw in her own mirror every day. The world doesn't stop when our children die, though we desperately wish it would, Judge Crawford said. Bills still come. Jobs still demand our attention. Parking tickets still need to be paid. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. But perhaps it should stop, just for a little while. The courtroom remained absolutely still. Even the bailiff was watching with an expression of surprise. Ms. Johnson, this court finds that exceptional circumstances warrant the dismissal of all fines and penalties in this matter. Judge Crawford's official tone returned, though his eyes remained kind. Case dismissed. Sarah stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Thank you, Your Honor, she whispered. Ms. Johnson, there's something else. Judge Crawford leaned forward slightly. Court will recess for lunch in 5 minutes. If you're willing, I'd like to speak with you privately in my chambers. Sarah hesitated, confused by the unusual request, but something in the judge's expression, a shared understanding of unimaginable loss, made her nod in agreement. Yes, Your Honor. I'll stay. As she returned to her seat, Sarah felt the weight on her shoulders shift slightly. Not lighter exactly, but different. For the first time in months, someone had truly seen her pain and acknowledged it. Whatever Judge Crawford wanted to discuss, Sarah found herself curious to hear. Judge Crawford's chambers looked nothing like Sarah had expected. Instead of the intimidating formal office she had imagined, the room felt almost cozy. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick legal volumes and family photos. A worn leather couch sat against one wall, and the judge's desk was cluttered with papers and coffee mugs. Please, have a seat, Judge Crawford said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. He had removed his black robe, and in his shirt and tie, he looked more like a tired school principal than a powerful judge. Sarah sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap. She noticed a framed photo on the judge's desk, a young woman with a bright smile, wearing a graduation cap and gown. Emma, she guessed, the judge's daughter. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Judge Crawford said as he settled into his chair. I want to apologize for how your case was handled initially. Had I known the circumstances? You couldn't have known, Sarah said quietly. I didn't tell anyone. I just stopped dealing with things. The judge nodded slowly. When Emma died, I came back to work after just 1 week. My wife thought I was crazy. He gave a sad smile. I wasn't ready, but I thought the routine would help. I ended up yelling at a 19-year-old boy over a jaywalking ticket because he looked so alive while my daughter wasn't. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. I keep finding myself angry at random people. A mother yelling at her son in the grocery store. A teenager complaining about homework. I want to scream at them to appreciate what they have. The anger is normal, Judge Crawford said. So is forgetting things like parking tickets. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small business card. After Emma died, my wife and I found a support group. Parents who've lost children. At first, I refused to go. What could strangers possibly say to make any difference? He slid the card across the desk toward Sarah. But sitting in a room with people who understand, it helped. Not right away, but eventually. Sarah picked up the card, Healing Hearts. Thursdays at 7 p.m., she read aloud. They meet at the community center, Judge Crawford explained. The same place where you got your parking ticket, ironically. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a small smile tug at her lips. Life has strange circles, doesn't it? The judge nodded. Very strange indeed. He hesitated before continuing. Ms. Johnson, may I ask who's been helping you through this time? Family? Friends? Sarah looked down at her hands. My husband died 3 years ago. Cancer. My parents live in Florida. They came for the funeral but couldn't stay long. She swallowed hard. My neighbors check on me sometimes. My coworkers try, but it's hard for people to know what to say. And so, they say nothing at all. Judge Crawford finished for her. Or they tell you time will heal, when you know nothing will ever be the same again. Sarah nodded, feeling tears threatening again. This strange conversation with a judge she'd never met before today was somehow the most honest discussion she'd had since Michael died. I'm not going to tell you it gets better, Judge Crawford said softly. That's not true, and we both know it. But it does get different. The pain changes shape. Some days it's not as sharp. He reached for a tissue box on his desk and offered it to Sarah. She hadn't realized she was crying until that moment. 3 years after Emma, I still have days where I can barely function, the judge continued. But I also have days where I can remember her and smile. You'll have those days too. Sarah wiped her eyes. I keep waiting to wake up from this nightmare. I know. Judge Crawford's voice was filled with understanding. The group meets tomorrow night. No pressure, but if you decide to go. He paused. My wife and I will be there. You wouldn't have to walk in alone. For the first time since Michael died, Sarah felt a tiny spark of something that wasn't pain or numbness. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin, the possibility that she might someday learn to carry her grief without being crushed by it. I'll think about it, she said honestly. The judge nodded. That's all anyone can ask. Sarah spent all of Tuesday thinking about the support group. She placed Judge Crawford's card on her refrigerator, but found herself avoiding the kitchen so she wouldn't have to see it. The thought of sitting in a room full of strangers, talking about Michael, made her stomach twist. I'm not ready, she told Michael's photo that night. His smiling face looked back at her from the frame, forever 16, forever on the edge of his future. Wednesday dragged by in a fog of routine. Sarah went to work, moved through her shift like a robot, and came home to her empty house. She made dinner but didn't eat it. She turned on the TV but didn't watch it. The silence pressed in around her like a physical weight. On Thursday morning, Sarah woke from a dream about Michael. In the dream, he was sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinosaur pancakes and laughing. When she reached out to touch his hair, he looked up at her with serious eyes. Mom, you need to go tonight, Dream Michael had said. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The dream had felt so real that she almost called out for him. The disappointment of waking to reality crashed over her anew. She went through her day in a daze, the decision about the support group hanging over her. By the time her shift ended at 6 p.m., Sarah still hadn't made up her mind. Johnson, you heading home? Asked Nancy, another night shift nurse. I'm not sure, Sarah answered honestly. Nancy gave her a concerned look. You okay? Sarah almost said yes automatically, but stopped herself. Not really. I'm thinking about going to a support group tonight, for parents who've lost children. Nancy's face softened. I think that's a great idea, Sarah. Do you want me to go with you? I could wait outside if you need a ride. The kindness in Nancy's voice nearly broke Sarah's composure. Thanks, but I think someone might be there I know. Sort of. It was strange to think of Judge Crawford as someone she knew, but their conversation had created a connection. At 6:45 p.m., Sarah found herself in the parking lot of the community center, sitting in her car with the engine off. People were already heading inside, men and women of different ages, some alone, some in pairs. Sarah watched them, wondering if their stories were similar to hers. Heart conditions, car accidents, cancer, so many different paths to the same terrible destination. At 6:55, a silver sedan pulled into the space next to Sarah's car. Judge Crawford stepped out, followed by a petite woman with short gray hair. The judge was wearing jeans and a sweater, looking nothing like the imposing figure from the courtroom. He noticed Sarah sitting in her car and gave her a small nod of recognition but didn't approach, giving her space to decide. Sarah watched as the judge and his wife walked toward the building, their hands clasped together. They had found a way to keep going, to live with their loss without letting it destroy them. Maybe she could learn how they did that. At exactly 7 o'clock, Sarah opened her car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. The community center's meeting room was arranged in a circle of chairs. 15 people were already seated, some talking quietly with each other, others sitting in silence. A table near the door held coffee, water, and cookies that no one seemed interested in eating. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, suddenly wanting to run back to her car. Then she felt a gentle touch on her arm. Judge Crawford's wife stood beside her, her eyes kind and understanding. I'm Margaret, she said softly. William told me about you. The first time is the hardest. You can just listen if you want. I don't know what to say to these people, Sarah whispered. Margaret's smile was sad but genuine. You don't have to say anything. But these people understand what you're going through in a way no one else can, even if you just sit and breathe. You're not alone here." Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. Together, they walked into the room where Judge Crawford had saved 2 empty chairs. Sarah sat down, her hands trembling slightly as a middle-aged man in the center of the circle began to speak. "Welcome, everyone. For those joining us for the first time, I'm David. I lost my son Alex 8 years ago. We're glad you found the courage to come tonight." As Sarah looked around the circle, she realized something startling. Every person in this room was broken in the same way she was, and yet, somehow, they were still here. Still breathing. Still living. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn how to do that too. The support group meeting lasted 2 hours, though to Sarah it felt both longer and shorter than that. Each person in the circle had a chance to speak, but no one was forced to. Some shared stories about their children. Others talked about difficult moments they had faced that week, a birthday, a holiday, a random memory that hit them while doing groceries. Sarah didn't speak. She sat quietly, listening as parents described feelings that mirrored her own. The anger, the emptiness, the way grief could suddenly knock the air from their lungs when they least expected it. A woman named Diane spoke about finding her daughter's hair tie under the couch 6 months after she died and crying for hours. A man named Roberto described how he still couldn't delete his son's phone number from his contacts list 3 years later. "I call it sometimes," he admitted, "just to hear the voicemail message." Sarah thought of Michael's phone, still charging every night on her bedside table. She hadn't been able to disconnect the service yet. Sometimes she sent text messages to it, telling Michael about her day as if he might somehow read them. Near the end of the meeting, David, the group leader, turned to Sarah with a gentle smile. "We have a new member tonight. Sarah, we're glad you're here. Would you like to share anything, or would you prefer to just listen tonight?" All eyes turned to her with understanding, not pressure. Sarah felt her throat tighten. I'm Sarah," she managed. "My son Michael died in April. He was 17. The words hung in the air, stark and terrible, but somehow saying them aloud felt important. "That's all I can say right now." David nodded. "Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Michael is welcome here too. His memory, his name, his story. Whenever you're ready." After the meeting ended, people lingered, talking in small groups. Sarah stood awkwardly, not sure if she should leave or stay. Judge Crawford, William, as he was called here, approached with 2 cups of coffee. "It gets easier," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Not the grief, but coming to the meetings." Sarah accepted the coffee, warming her hands around the paper cup. "Everyone seems to know each other so well. Most of us have been coming for years," William explained, "but we all had a first meeting once." He gestured toward his wife, who was talking with Roberto across the room. "Margaret couldn't speak at all for the first 3 months. Now she helps run the group." Sarah took a small sip of coffee. "Do you think it helps? Really helps?" William considered her question seriously. "It doesn't bring them back. Nothing can do that. But it helps to be around people who don't expect you to get over it or move on." He looked at her directly. "People who understand that you're going to love your child and miss your child for the rest of your life." For the first time, Sarah felt a small weight lift from her chest. The weight of pretending to be okay, of trying to meet the world's expectations for how grief should look. "Thank you for telling me about this place," she said softly. "And thank you for what you did in court." William shook his head. "I didn't do anything special, just showed some basic human decency." "It felt special to me," Sarah insisted. "It was the first time since Michael died that someone truly saw me." As they talked, Margaret joined them, gently placing a hand on Sarah's arm. "Will you come next week?" she asked. Sarah hesitated. "I'm not sure I have anything to offer to the group." Margaret's eyes were kind but serious. "You being here helps everyone. Seeing new people reminds us all that we're not alone, that others walk this path too." The 3 of them walked to the parking lot together. The night air was cool, and stars dotted the clear sky above them. Sarah paused beside her car, looking up at the brightness against the darkness. "Michael loved astronomy," she said suddenly. "He knew all the constellations. Sometimes we would lie in the backyard, and he would point them out to me." William and Margaret looked up with her, their faces gentle in the dim light. "Which was his favorite?" William asked. "Orion," Sarah answered, her voice catching. "He said it was the easiest to find, like an old friend in the sky. Margaret pointed to the eastern horizon. It's not visible yet. It's a winter constellation, but it will be back in a few months. Just like we'll be here next Thursday, William added quietly. Same time, same place. Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes, but her heart feeling something close to peace for the first time in months. I think I'd like to come back, she said. I think Michael would want me to. As she drove home that night, Sarah felt different. The grief was still there, heavy and constant. But for the first time, she felt like she might not have to carry it entirely alone. 6 months passed since Sarah's first support group meeting. Fall turned to winter, and the holiday season arrived with its mix of joy and sorrow. Sarah had been attending Healing Hearts every Thursday without fail. Some weeks she spoke about Michael, sharing memories that made her smile through tears. Other weeks she just listened, drawing strength from the circle of people who understood her pain without explanation. On a cold December evening, Sarah stood in her kitchen baking cookies. Michael had always loved her chocolate chip cookies, especially around Christmas. This year, she was making them for the support group's holiday gathering. As she worked, Sarah realized something had changed. The kitchen no longer felt like a place to avoid. Michael's photos no longer caused only pain when she looked at them. She still cried, still missed him with every breath, but the sharp edges of grief had softened just enough to let her function. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to answer it. To her surprise, Judge William Crawford and his wife Margaret stood on her porch, bundled in winter coats. Sorry to drop by unannounced, William said. We were in the neighborhood and wanted to give you something. Sarah invited them in, quickly clearing books from the couch to make space. Her house was no longer the shrine to grief it had once been. Signs of life had returned. A half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, fresh flowers in a vase, Christmas lights strung along the windows. The place looks nice, Margaret commented, noticing the small Christmas tree in the corner. It was decorated with ornaments Sarah and Michael had collected over the years. It's the first time I put up decorations, Sarah admitted. I almost didn't, but then I thought Michael would hate to see the house dark for Christmas. He loved the lights. William nodded in understanding. The first holiday is the hardest. We didn't celebrate Christmas the year after Emma died. The second year, we put up just one ornament, her favorite. Each year, we added a little more. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small box wrapped in silver paper. That's why we wanted to give you this. Sarah accepted the gift with surprise. You didn't have to bring me anything. Open it, Margaret encouraged gently. Sarah carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a beautiful glass ornament in the shape of a star. The name Michael was painted across it in elegant script, along with the dates of his birth and death. We get one made each year for Emma, William explained. We thought you might like one for Michael. Stars seemed right, since you mentioned he loved astronomy. Sarah held the ornament carefully, running her finger over Michael's name. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't only tears of sadness. This is beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. Together, the three of them hung the ornament on Sarah's tree, placing it near the top where the lights made the glass sparkle. We have something else to ask you, William said as they stepped back to admire the tree. The hospital is organizing a scholarship in Michael's name for students interested in medicine or nursing. We'd like your permission to help set it up. Sarah turned to them in surprise. A scholarship? How? The court staff took up a collection, William explained. When people heard your story, they wanted to help. Then some of the hospital staff joined in. It's not a huge amount, but it's enough to help one student each year. Michael would have loved that, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. He was always helping his classmates with their homework. The three of them moved to the kitchen, where the smell of cookies filled the air. As Sarah poured coffee, she noticed the calendar hanging on her refrigerator. There, circled in red, was tomorrow's date, December 15th. She had written return to full-time work next to it. I'm going back to regular shifts tomorrow, she told William and Margaret. I've been working part-time since July, but I finally feel ready for more. Margaret squeezed her hand. That's wonderful, Sarah. I'm still broken, Sarah admitted. I'll always be missing a piece of my heart, but I'm learning to live with the broken parts. William nodded. That's all any of us can do. As they sat at her kitchen table, sharing cookies and stories about their children, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected to feel again, a sense of peace. Not happiness exactly, but a quiet acceptance that life could continue even after unimaginable loss. The parking ticket that had brought her to court that day had seemed like just another burden in her grief. But instead, it had led her to people who helped her find her way back to living. Michael was gone, but his memory remained, shining like Orion in the winter sky, a constant presence guiding her forward.